His skipper asked him to move forward and make sure nothing else fell out. Well, he fell out.
Did soldiers fall out of helicopters in Vietnam? Yes, they did. And when it happened, it usually ended exactly how you think. But that question only scratches the surface. In Vietnam, riding in a helicopter meant facing a dozen other ways to die. Enemy fire, engine failure, crash landings, or flying straight into an ambush with nowhere to hide. More than 12,000 helicopters were sent to Vietnam. Nearly half of them were destroyed. 1 in every 18 helicopter pilots didn't make it home. There was no armor, no protection from bullets or shrapnel. Crews flew with nothing more than a flak vest, a helmet, and a seatbelt, if they chose to wear it. So yes, some did fall, but far more were shot, burned, or brought down hard. This is what it really meant to fly in Vietnam. When helicopters first arrived in Vietnam, they were seen as the future of warfare. Fast, mobile, and able to move troops and supplies into areas that trucks and tanks could not reach. The concept was simple: fly in quickly, drop the soldiers, and leave before the enemy could respond. That was the theory. In practice, it looked very different. Most helicopters, especially the famous UH-1 Huey, were designed for transport, not combat. They had no ability to withstand serious enemy fire. But helicopter warfare in Vietnam quickly became one of the most brutal and lethal forms of combat. They flew at low altitudes, just a few hundred feet up, and at speeds of around 80 miles per hour. That made them easy targets. They could not rely on speed or altitude to avoid enemy fire, as was assumed in the beginning. The helicopters carried troops, fuel, and ammunition, all packed into a lightweight frame. One well-placed shot could take out the crew or ignite everything on board. By the end of the war, more than 5,000 helicopters had been lost. Nearly 3,000 of them were Hueys. Most were brought down by small arms, heavy machine guns, or RPGs, which were cheap, portable, and widely used by enemy forces. Crews flew missions every day knowing how vulnerable they were. Scramble alerts could happen at any moment. When one came through, the primary crew had 4 minutes to lift off. The rest had 10 minutes from their quarters to be airborne. As the Army was desperate for pilots and helicopter crews, many were recruited straight out of flight schools. After completing rapid training programs, all pilots deemed good enough to fly were sent directly to Vietnam. Army pilots weren't even trained for night flying because it was deemed unnecessary. While they learned how to operate helicopters, hover and land, combat missions were something entirely different. Vietnam veterans said that helicopters were flown by a bunch of kids, and when you add to that the unreliability of the early so-called flying coffin helicopters, heavy weather conditions, and a determined enemy, you get the catastrophic results. Nevertheless, the Vietnam War produced over 55,000 helicopter pilots. Upon arrival in Vietnam, crews were quickly assigned to their roles, with some thrust directly into combat missions. They would quickly learn that Vietnam was unlike anything they had trained for. Experienced crews passed down the most important lessons to rookies about how not to get killed on their first day, how to fly in hostile zones, and what to do when under fire. During major engagements, the demand for helicopters was overwhelming. Sometimes there simply weren't enough crews, so crews sometimes had to pull double or even triple 12-hour shifts, as ground troops urgently needed their support. Not flying often meant certain death for those on the ground, so crews were pushed to and beyond their physical and psychological limits, logging hundreds of flight hours in just a few months. Records show that Hueys alone flew nearly 10.7 million hours, while Cobras logged over 1 million. Throughout the war, over 30 million missions were flown, and on average, helicopters were shot down every 80 missions. Yet veterans said that refusing a mission took more courage than flying it, knowing how many lives depended on them. Crews spent hundreds of hours inside helicopters, in immense heat, noise, vibrations, and discomfort under their flak jackets and helmets. Maintaining focus for such long periods inevitably led to breaking points, and that's when accidents happened, often with catastrophic consequences. Around 40% of damaged helicopters were attributed to human error. Heavy rains and monsoon seasons made flying even more dangerous, and of course, there was the enemy fire. During high-risk missions, while under or expecting fire, both the pilot and co-pilot were trained to keep their hands near the controls in case one of them was hit, so the other could immediately take over. Crews had minimal protection besides their so-called chicken plates or flak jackets, which could stop some shrapnel. Even a single lucky hit from an AK could critically damage the aircraft or take out its crew, both of which were not rare occurrences. Flying at low altitudes to avoid detection made helicopters easy targets for a wide range of weapons and also increased the risk of hitting obstacles. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army devised creative ways to make their job as dangerous as possible. Ambushing landing zones or setting traps to lure Americans into kill zones became standard tactics. They studied US strategies and learned to predict next steps, such as when medevac helicopters, gunships, or reinforcements were about to arrive, allowing them to design their attacks to inflict maximum damage. RPGs were also a significant threat when helicopters hovered low to deliver or extract troops. One hit from an RPG could result in the complete destruction of the aircraft and everyone aboard. Snipers around landing zones tried to take out pilots or critical components like the tail rotor, fuel tanks, or hydraulic systems. Some traps at landing zones were even designed to be triggered by the rotor wash of a helicopter. Most Hueys had their doors removed so the machine guns could be mounted. This also helped with the heat and sped up troop mounting and dismounting, but made it dangerous for unstrapped soldiers, who, as we said, could fall out, and sometimes did. A sharp turn or sudden hit could throw someone out instantly. The standard safety measure was a lap belt. It looked like something from a commercial airliner or a car. Most crew members didn't use it because it restricted movement. Instead, door gunners liked to use what was known as the monkey harness, a strap worn over the torso and clipped to a fixed point in the cabin. This didn't stop them from falling out, but did stop them from dying. They would hang on it until someone could drag them back in. In emergencies, helicopters carried far more people than their weight or space limits allowed, with some even clinging to skids or rocket pods so they wouldn't be left behind. And actually, the biggest danger of falling out was during landings and takeoffs, especially when they are under fire. Centrifugal force helps keep people inside the helicopter during flight, especially when the aircraft is banking or turning sharply. The force pushes everything outward against the frame, which can make it feel more stable inside, but that changes during takeoff and landing. At low speeds or when hovering, there's little to no centrifugal force keeping people in place. If a soldier is standing near the door, they can fall out during a rough landing, sudden maneuver, or if the helicopter takes a hit and jerks off course. Some jumped out too early under fire, others lost their footing in the rush to get out, or were simply thrown clear when the aircraft tilted or rolled unexpectedly. One combat cameraman in 1969 mounted a 16mm camera to the barrel of an M60 using a custom setup that triggered the camera with the gun. While adjusting it during a UH-1 flight in Operation Dewey Canyon, the helicopter suddenly banked to dodge ground fire. He wasn't wearing a gunner's belt and lost his balance, falling out through the open door. But as the aircraft rolled again in the opposite direction, he was thrown back inside by the force. The door gunner looked down at him, stunned, eyes wide. He got up and clipped in immediately. During a combat assault with the 11th Light Infantry Brigade, one radio man was seated on the floor of a UH-1 with his feet on the skid as the helicopter approached the landing zone. Around 15 feet from the ground, he stood up on the skid to get ready for the jump. At that moment, the left strap of his overloaded rucksack broke. The extra weight from the PRC-25 radio and a spare battery caused the pack to swing around and pull him off balance. He fell backward out of the helicopter and dropped roughly 10 to 12 feet, landing on his upper back and fracturing 3 vertebrae. Later, one of his squadmates said he saw the fall, assumed he had been hit, and opened fire. The rest followed. What had been a cold landing zone turned hot in seconds. When we're talking about soldiers falling out of helicopters in Vietnam, not every story sounded like an accident. Some stories circulated among troops that suggested something else, although were never actually confirmed by evidence. One of them involved captured enemy fighters. According to the version passed around, special forces would sometimes take 2 prisoners up in a Huey for questioning. If the first refused to talk, he'd be thrown out the door. The second usually gave answers after that. It's hard to say how effective any kind of interrogation could even be inside a helicopter with the noise of the engine and the rotors, but stories like this did go around. There was, however, at least one known incident in 1968 that may have contributed to this. During a routine flight, a deceased Viet Cong prisoner reportedly fell or was dropped out of a helicopter while being transported. Observers who weren't directly involved misinterpreted what they saw and assumed a live prisoner had been deliberately thrown out. That version of events spread fast and stuck, but if those stories were true or not was never confirmed.